This series of videos introduces the 38 chapters of the Routledge Handbook of Environmental Movements. It's a project of the Social Change Lab, and we gratefully acknowledge the support of the Mary Lee Bequest for the work of our team.
Okay. Hi, everyone. My name is Winifred Lewis, and I'm a professor of psychology at the University of Queensland.
Hi, everyone. I'm Andrea Zhang. I am a psychologist and a research assistant in University of Queensland.
Hi, I'm Yuqi Liu, a UQ psychology student.
And what we're doing is we're making introductory videos for all of the 38 chapters of the Routledge Handbook of Environmental Movements. And today we're here to talk about chapter 3. I just read it out. It's called Rhapsody in Green, Environmental Movements in East Central Europe. And the author is Andrzej Cezar, and he's a professor of sociology at Charles University in Prague, in the Czech Republic. The chapter takes an historical approach and examines a number of historical periods. It starts off looking at the environmental movement in Eastern Europe before the end of communism. Can you tell us about that, Andrea?
Yeah, sure. So the first part of the chapter is basically introducing the anti-communism activity before the 1989, before the communist regime collapsed. And environmental mobilization is closely related to this anti-communist movement in many East European countries. And most of the social movements are concerned with human and civil rights against the communist region, and it also established a close relationship with environmental movements because it is framed by the activists as human rights related problem, as it is a violation to the right for people's right to live in a clean environments. You're right.
Are you going on from there?
Yes. And at the end of the 1980s, there is a turning point when environmental issues have become very powerful in political mobilization as they resonated with people's everyday life experience, especially those who live in the environmentally damaged areas. And they become so powerful that the government are unable to control them. And they have a tendency to support for democracy, human rights, and the protection of environmental for the environment. Yeah.
Awesome. And then what happened after the fall of the communist governments, Yuqi?
Yeah, so just after the communist regime collapsed, many different new powers came into the charge. So this environmental issue become a really hot topic for every groups and parties that they try to get the vote from their people. However, because they just came from the Communist Party, they have experienced many massive movement. So what they really do is also using the same strategies like strike or to blocking something like these sort of violent behavior to push the government to legislate the relevant laws to protect the environment. Some criticize these behaviors may not that work. However, in fact, they probably accelerate the legislation of the official government setting for these environment laws. Yeah.
And there was a sort of an interesting tension that the author talks about in the chapter where many former activists joined the new governments. So they actually were part of the new kind of policy and legislative settings where they were making new laws for the environment. But then they got cross when people continued to protest. They were kind of like, well, you're supposed to support us. And so that was really part of the next section, which I'll tell you about, which was really talking about the lead up to joining the European Union and what was happening. And basically, there was a tension where, on the one hand, there's lots of former activists in the new government, and they were kind of open to new environmental policies. particularly because the European Union was asking for action on environmental laws. And so they often would be a pressure or leverage point to kind of create the movement. And then there was also a sense where the environmental movement was somehow losing energy and becoming depoliticized and becoming institutionalized, like being part of the mainstream. And then after they joined the EU, the dynamic sort of changed again, right? Because there was funding that started flowing.
Yeah.
Which of you guys is going to talk about that?
Yeah, sure. So after the exception of the European Union, they kind of this organization kind of open up new opportunities and provide transnational resources for new environmental groups and activists, and they power up these new groups because this national environmental, like this kind of connections between the environmental groups and the European Union benefits them a lot by putting pressure on their local government, and also by mobilizing and attracting international public opinion. So the European Union level network actually can be like the benefits can be classified into two ways. So first, it changed the domestic rules of the game, and they redistribute the available resources in the domestic political area. And also, they expand the scope of those environmental and political activities and let them to enter an interaction with the like across the European countries, and kind of facilitated the communications between those networks.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think the author like highlights the positives of that as well as some of the points of tension. So one of the comments that I remember from that section of the book is talking about how, on the one hand, all this money and training is flowing into the countries to the environmental movements, connecting them in with international networks. On the other hand, it tends to be a lot of pressure to do kind of what they call professionalized and institutionalized activities. So a lot of report writing and commenting on draft legislation and policies. It can be really positive, but can also be a bit alienated from the grassroots. So I thought that was just a really interesting point. And I guess it flows on to the next part, right? Because something that happened after this wave is really the new protest movements that are a lot more grassroots. Can you tell us about that section of the chapter, Yuchi?
Yeah, sure. So like just after the old fashions like green movement, the new fashion movement, including like Fight for Friday and Extinction Rebellion group, has like reformed the activities in all these Eastern European countries. Like, however, like these countries are divided into two sides. Some of the countries that believes these new forms of activities could raise the awareness of the public, increase the public awareness of protecting environment. However, some other countries like Hungary, I remembered that they believe these, like because these new activities are, like most participants are young people, so they believe it is kind of naive and immature behaviors, which cause just chaos in the societies. Therefore, like there's still a lot of like debatings on these different countries, and
yeah. And it was interesting too, because one point that they made in the chapter is that part of what determined what the protesters were doing was what the politicians were doing. So at the same time as all of this new protest is occurring, or shortly before, the great financial crisis had kind of rushed through and decimated the economies of Europe. And in a lot of the countries like Hungary and Poland, right-wing governments came to power, and they're hostile to protests generally. And they support economic growth as a sort of solution following the great financial crisis in a way that sometimes has not meant to protect the environment. So there was an interesting point that was made by the author that in some countries where they're not debating, the politicians are worried about the economy. That means the protesters are speaking about the environment. And in other countries where there's been more political party debate around the environment, sometimes that means there's less energy in the protests because they're watching and participating in the Democratic Parliament. So overall, I thought it was a really interesting chapter. I learned a lot about the environmental movements of Eastern Europe. I learned about like some of the changes over the last few decades, and thinking again, as I guess is a theme in the handbook, about how the history and economy and geography connect in with what the environmental movements are doing. What about you guys? Did you have any, what was your main point from the chapter, Andrea?
One thing I really like about this chapter is that it presents the fluctuation and like the attitude change when like we can see the environmental movement cannot be looked separately from the related political context. And you can see from the very first, like the environmental movement and activists kind of embrace the democratic government. And after the communist government falls and a new government formed, they are rejected, like the government again. And they are alienated from like the power and the media attention. So they have to seek support from foreign fundings and from like European Union and to like as another way to gain attention. But this way, again, kind of shift them away from the grassroots movements and make them more being like too professional and away from their from the local people. So I think what I really learned from the chapter is that how we can better like support the local environmental movements, and also give them the appropriate support, and also help them to really connect with the local society and able to gain political, in some way gain political powers, so they can like have their effect at the most.
Yeah, that's awesome. And what about you, Yuchi?
So I just feel that this, because of the financial crisis, so the people live in these poor countries are more seeking for the material stuff to satisfy their life, and like this could become a really important issue for the future leaders, that they need to make sure they feed their people first, and then to take care about the environment. Otherwise, like people will not support them.
Yeah. So, how I take it too is that like the leaders construct that opposition sometimes. Like some leaders would say, well, taking care of the environment is part of protecting our future and our food security. And other people say, no, there's like an opposition. And so we've got to, wait on environmental issues and do other things first. It's really interesting. And I really think that part of the chapter is a strength, like really bringing out these themes. Well, we might stop there. And I want to say thank you to Andrea and Yuchi for participating in the recording today. And thank you to our viewers for watching. We appreciate your time. Bye now.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
For those of you watching, be sure to subscribe and follow us at Social Change UQ, and check out our website for more videos.